Hello and welcome to this session, part of the Barker Transforming Energy Management series. My name is Rob Gould and I'm joined today by Tom Deacon, and today we're going to be doing a session on delivering solar PV and LED lighting projects. So I'm going to start the session by just having a quick recap on the benefits of energy transformation and why we're doing this in the first place, and particularly why the impetus has increased in recent months. Show you a few figures about why doing nothing is now costing you money and why it's really important that you take the initiative and move with these projects as quickly as possible. We're going to look at some of the barriers to why you might not have done this already. Typically those are lack of capital funding, and I'm going to address that through looking at the funding options, and then I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk through some of the more practical implications of delivering PV and LED, going through the process of delivering those projects, how they might affect your academy and school operations, project management, talk about some of the risks and issues, and finish with a bit of a checklist around some due diligence that you might want to do before embarking on these sort of projects, and finish up with some case studies, next steps, and opportunities for any questions. So the benefits of energy transformation are clear and wide-ranging. Obviously, in the first instance, you can look at using energy efficiency projects to substantially reduce your long-term energy costs, and in the past few months this has only been put into sharper focus with the sharp increase in energy costs on the energy market. And if we look at PV, solar PV in particular, it gives you the opportunity to generate your own power, which is slightly different than becoming more energy efficient, but allows you to, as we will show, buy your electricity at a fixed rate for the next 25 years, thus insulating yourselves from future energy price inflation. Obviously, moving on this journey of PV and LED starts your overall journey towards net zero carbon emissions. Sustainability itself is clearly a large and complex area, and one of the things we want to do with today's session is cut through some of the noise relating to all the different technologies, funding solutions, and things you might be able to do, and show you why we think that for the majority of schools the starting point should be PV and LED installations across the majority of your schools to get you onto this journey of saving and reinvestment. The other, on top of the financial savings, obviously there are a number of softer but very important aspects to doing this, not least the carbon savings that are possible from doing these sort of projects, but also the opportunities for education, for engaging your learners in sustainability and raising the profile of your organisation within the community that you serve. And we're talking about some of these, particularly with the PV installations, being some quite long-term solutions. So we're really looking at leaving a financial as well as a carbon saving legacy for the communities and young people and country in general through engaging with these sort of programs. So I don't think many people would argue about the concept of feeling that they should be doing something. What we now need to look at is why we should be doing it now, and in particular why doing nothing will cost you money in the long term. And I've got a graph here, and I appreciate it looks reasonably complex, but I'm just going to show you a few important points to hopefully illustrate the issue. So if we start with these three lines here, these are showing a baseline energy price indexation from 2004 at different rates of inflation. So the yellow line at the bottom is showing what will happen to energy prices if they increased by an average of 7% a year. This blue line at 9% and the pink line at 10%. And these all track back to 2004, and the reason for that is that this is when the but the data was publicly available from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And what you can see overlaid with these three baseline figures is the actuals that have occurred taking the BEIS data for small and medium consumers. And you can see that actually it tracked fairly closely along these lines until 2008 and was actually increasing at a rate of about 10% up until that point. And the financial crash in financial crisis in 2008 did actually cause an attenuation in that rate of inflation, which is why you can see it decreasing here. But had that financial shock not occurred and the 10% rate been continued up to today's point, you'd actually be looking at following this pink line here. And actually, if we take where we are today at 30 pence per kilowatt hour, which is where this line is actually the rate that many organisations are now being faced with when they're looking at renewing their energy contracts. So over the period, and it's likely that this is going to come down and is probably a bit of a short-term shock, but even if it comes down to say 20 pence, we can still see that we're looking at an inflation rate of say 9 or 8%, which is significant and is causing many organisations to have some quite significant and unbudgeted for rises in their energy costs. So the bar chart in grey at the bottom is actually some real data that we hold based on some of the large trusts that we've been working with on this decarbonisation journey over the past 4 or 5 years. And you can see this steady increase based on step changes as long-term contracts are renewed, and it's largely tracking along the lower rate at 7%. However, these same organisations, and I'm sure many of you are in a similar position, have got contracts up for renewal either today, either this year or in 2022. And if you're actually in that position at the moment, you are going to be seeing some quite frightening figures being quoted around the 30 pence per kilowatt hour rate for your electricity, which is probably close to, if not more than double what you're paying at the moment. So this is the rates of inflation. This is where we've got to up to date. This is where we are as a short-term shock. These final lines here, the black line, is to show you what your energy costs would be, or what your electricity costs would be if you had installed a solar PV system, or if you did so immediately. The reason this black line has got a step in it is it's showing that for the first 7 months, this is assuming that you fund it through an operating lease solution, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail shortly. So over those first 7 years, you'll be making those payments. You'll still be saving money. Your energy costs will still be lower than the sort of baseline rates. But then once that 7-year lease payment has finished, that drops off completely, and you're getting the rest of the electricity for free for the rest of the life of those panels. And all this green line here is showing is what that same figure is if you just smoothed it over the entire period. So it's basically just taking out the difference in the lease payments and then down to zero and smoothing that across 25 years. The final line, the green at the bottom, is the same solution, but if you funded it using your own cash reserves or school condition allocation money, which many trusts are doing if they're in a position to do so. And that just shows that the price of the electricity that you're buying is even lower, because you obviously haven't got the finance costs associated with that. But I think in summary, the message is quite clear. Obviously, the energy price inflation, whether it's 10%, 9%, 7% or lower, is likely to go only one way, and that's up. And anything you can do to get your energy costs on these lines over here flatlined or substantially reduced from those rates is going to save you money. And by doing it now, you're going to get greater benefit. The final point to make here is the marginal benefit of the financed versus the cash reserves options here. And although there is a benefit to using reserves, and that's still a preferable option if you want to fully optimize your returns, the real message is here that is don't let that small additional cost of the finance put you off, because in the larger scheme of things, it's much better to be on this dark green line than it is to be on any of these other rates up here. So whichever option you choose, they're all better than doing nothing. In terms of the opportunities you've got for introducing energy efficiency strategies and decarbonisation technology within your estates, here are the sort of 10 key opportunities that we advise clients form the core of your energy efficiency strategy. And really today, what we're highlighting here is the LED and the PV panels as being the key technologies that are going to kickstart this journey. The reason for that is that the other projects might have all got their advantages, and in some cases, for example, with boiler replacement, will actually save more carbon potentially than the technologies that we're talking about today. But the challenge with those is that the financial models and the payback periods just do not lend themselves to early adoption, which is why we're finding that funding bodies such as Salix and BEIS and the like are now concentrating their grant funding on the decarbonisation of heat and have moved away from LED and lighting and PV panels. And that's because those stack up in terms of creating a business case, stack up on their own without any external support. And that's why you can use commercial funding opportunities to deliver those projects without having to wait for some potential grant funding opportunity in the future. So we're going to concentrate very much on these two solutions today to use those as a kickstarter and show how they can generate a surplus, which can then be reinvested as you see fit, potentially in other energy efficiency projects to generate a cyclical sort of sinking fund of ongoing savings, or could just be reinvested simply in your organisation's operational budgets and helping to go straight to the front line to deliver, further educational outcomes in line with your organisation's education vision. So, what are the typical savings that we might be looking at with the solar PV and LED lighting technologies that we're talking about? I've just put some figures here, and you'll obviously understand that these are very much broad brush budget figures based on some assumptions, and every school is different, every site is different, every school has got different energy costs. So these are just broad brush to give you a typical flavour of what might be achievable at a typical primary or secondary school. And you can see that even at a basic level, LED lighting in a primary school is going to save, over the 10-year lifetime of that installation, 42 tonnes of carbon dioxide and save £30,000. And these are net savings on top of any finance costs or project management costs. And at the other end of the scale, putting PV on a secondary school, a typical secondary school, say a 150 kilowatt array on a typical secondary school, paying 14-15 pence a kilowatt hour currently, you're looking at over 600 tonnes of CO2 saved, and a saving of £740,000 over the lifetime of that installation. And these are conservative figures as well. We should point out we've made some assumptions, but we've seen in recent years, and obviously in very recent times with the energy inflation that I mentioned earlier, that it could well be that energy costs go up even faster than we've actually budgeted for. So I'm just going to work through a couple of examples just to briefly show you how that might work. So if we look at a typical LED lighting project, and a typical secondary school, from the data that we hold, consumes around 500 kilowatt hours per annum. And as I say, these are all very broad brush general points, but just to illustrate the point. But if a LED project should save at least 20% based on replacing obsolete lighting fittings, and these projects would generally be warranted for 10 years. So we're looking at savings over that period, even though in reality those panels are very likely to last 15 to 20 years. But the project cost for doing a secondary school is should be no more than £150,000 unless you've got any significant abnormals, and therefore over that 10-year period you should be looking at saving 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity over that 10-year period, which is 21 tonnes of carbon, and effectively that's where you're generating this saving. And if you sort of flip it into reversing it into what you're paying at the moment, it's effectively the equivalent of fixing your energy price at something around what it is at the moment, even though it's obviously not going to cover your entire electricity bill, but it'll make an impact on the element of lighting, which is a substantial part of a typical school's electrical costs. And for a solar PV system, the figures are even more stark, and which you can see why we're suggesting that you look at this really seriously in the coming weeks and months. Again, the same secondary school with a 500,000 kilowatt hour per annum electricity demand. A typical array, as I mentioned earlier, for a secondary school might be 150 kilowatt peak PV project. Often a bit larger depending on the size of the school, but a 150 kilowatt peak project would generate at least 127,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year, and these PV projects are warranted for 25 years, or certainly should be. We'll talk more about that in terms of technical due diligence later on. That sort of project should cost no more than £120,000, and therefore we're looking at saving 2.85 million kilowatt hours of electricity over that 25-year period. There's the carbon savings as well, but then you can see here that if you translate that into actual cost of that energy, you're effectively buying it at, and this if you use your cash reserves, buying it at just over 4 pence per kilowatt hour. So if you can, typically that might be say 25% of your electrical demand, and so you're going to pay only 4 pence per kilowatt hour for a quarter of your electricity bill, which is going to make a serious impact on your finances. And even if you use the private finance options that we're going to talk about in a moment, that price only goes up by 1 pence per kilowatt hour. If you compare 5p a kilowatt hour to what you're typically paying at the moment, say 15 pence, and what you might be asked to be renewing at in the next year or so, which could be 20 to 30 pence, you can see why the financial case for this is so compelling. So one of the barriers that often is put up and thought about in terms of why this hasn't been done already is obviously funding these projects. They're not cheap projects, particularly the solar PV, and what we really want to get over to you today is that there are a number of options available to your organisation, and it doesn't matter if you're a primary, a secondary, whether you're a maintained or an academy, if you're a standalone or in a multi-academy trust, at least one or two of these will be applicable to you, and there is very little reason why you can't find a funding solution that can enable you to get onto this decarbonisation journey. So just to run through the options, the first one being cash reserves, obviously using cash or your SCA. If you're a multi-academy trust, your organisation is going to realise 100% of the energy savings that is generated by the project. And if you look at PV, we're talking about returns on investment of 300 to 400%. This can provide a significant funding stream that can then be reinvested as you see fit in other parts of the estate or other parts of the school or trust. The advantages obviously are maximising your savings by using your own money, complete freedom and autonomy about how you run your own procurement and implementation program, and it's also quite often an option for perhaps smaller schools, smaller primaries, where the marginal gains are slightly less, and sometimes the funded solutions aren't quite so compelling. So what we have seen for some multi-academy trusts is using cash and reserves to fund the smaller primaries, and using a commercial funded option for doing the secondaries and balancing it out that way. Obviously the disadvantages are that you would need to have those funds available but there are schools and trusts that are sitting on reserves, and this is being used by a number of large trusts that we're working with at the moment as a very reasonable way of using those reserves to best advantage in getting a return on that money. The other disadvantage is obviously using your own money is it does tie up capital that could obviously be used for other things potentially. So that does need to be borne in mind if you've got other projects that you can't get funding for. You might be in a position where you want to retain your reserves for those and fund something like an energy project where there are alternatives available. So second solution I've put here, funding option, is grant funding. SALIX, you may well have come across, are at the current point, and as far as we understand, unlikely to do any further funding for PV and LED projects. They used to do 0% interest loans, and those are no longer open to trusts or academies for the reasons I identified earlier, that there are alternatives out there. So they're concentrating their funding on the stickier projects relating to heat decarbonisation. So it can, and there has been some grant funding available again in exceptional circumstances. The Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme was part of the government's COVID response programme, but that's now been rolled back to very much a heat-focused fund, and I think it's very unlikely that that will be returning to the kind of generous grants that were made a year or so ago. So there are actually some other smaller local isolated funds, mayoral funds and those sorts of things, and obviously if those are available to you, they are worth pursuing. There are potentially some match funding requirements. There's the administrative issues of actually applying, bidding for those and reporting on them, but you know, they might well be worth considering. But what we'd sort of suggest really in terms of the message here is look at these funded options that I'm about to come on to as your baseline, and understand that those are available, whatever. You don't need to bid for those, they're just available. And use that as your baseline, and if there are then any opportunities to mitigate the costs through applying for other grants, then that can obviously be built into the model, but you can use the funded options to establish a business case with your trustees and the like. So a power purchase agreement is something that you may have come across, and it's effectively a contract between two parties, one which generates electricity and one which is looking to purchase electricity. So an example might be where someone offers to put a solar array on your roof. They will fund that capital project up front and then sell the electricity to you at a pre-agreed rate. So it's a low-risk solution. It can be appropriate for very risk-averse organisations. However, what we've seen is that the rates of return are significantly less than the other options available, perhaps unlikely to generate a surplus, and there can be some quite significant due diligence and legals required in terms of entering into these sorts of arrangements. So it's certainly not a completely risk-free and bother-free solution, but it's something that you can always consider, but you should always look at it against the alternatives of either cash reserves or the operating lease, so that you can go into it with your eyes open and understand what the savings are going to be in relation to what some of the alternatives might be. So finally, the operating lease, and this is using private finance to fund the project up front. You make lease payments over an agreed period of time, typically say 7 years or 10 years for an LED or PV project, and so this is generally done on a 100% funded basis, which means you need little or no capital investment up front, and you can reinvest the savings that are generated. You've got, again, the same autonomy over program and procurement that you would have using your own money. And really the disadvantages are obviously there's an interest payment to be made, so that will reduce your rate of returns, but that sits in our experience between the power purchase agreement and using cash. And there can be some legals, obviously legals and complexity and due diligence required anytime you're entering into any sort of financial transaction. It doesn't work for all low carbon technologies, but it's very common very commonly being used for funding LED lighting and PV, which is obviously the subject of today's session. So the message is really that there are a number of funding options available. There should be something that's open to you, and at Barker we're very much agnostic. We're not going to try and push you down one particular route. We want to make you aware of all of the different options so that you're able to make an informed decision about what is best for your organisation, but hopefully with the understanding that there is something out there that you could be using, and using that as the catalyst to actually start on this decarbonisation journey. So that's the funding. That's the funding options covered. I'm now going to hand over to Tom, who's going to just talk you through some of the more practical aspects of designing, implementing, and delivering these projects on site.
Hello. Thank you very much, Rob, for the previous slides. I thought I would just take some time out now to talk you through some of the more specific detail around the implementation of these projects. Perhaps going into a bit more around how it's done, some of the possible pitfalls and learnings that we've gained over the years, and just give you a bit more information around how to implement these projects safely on school sites. So starting with PV, generally speaking, our involvement, certainly in the early stages, can very easily be done on a desktop basis. And we look at solar PV in that respect very regularly. The image you see on the right hand side there is actually a screenshot from something we call a PV Sol, a solar model, which is a reasonably accurate way initially of identifying suitable sites for solar PV. We do this on a desktop basis. The software is pretty clever. It looks at geographic location. It looks at the aspect and orientation of a possible PV array on a site, and fundamentally that starts to give us the data, the initial data, to go into to a business case, which is largely due. The main information is around the kilowatt peak output, so the electrical generation capacity for any one particular year for a PV array. And what our engineers do is we look at the available roof space. Largely we install on existing flattened and pitched roofs. Very rarely do we get involved in solar farms or ground mounted PV, because there is an additional cost to installing PV on the ground, additional metalwork, etc. So generally speaking, we would look at the existing buildings on a desktop basis, look at where you could possibly site PV, and then simulate that. And that basic information, although very high level and not based on any sort of specific site survey, gives you an indication of the likely scale of generation. What we then do, moving on to stage 3 of the process there, is start to put that information into our business case models, which look at both the cost and the carbon savings that could be achieved if that PV array was installed on the roof to the extent estimated. What we do there is we then start to look at that against your existing building consumption and look at how much of your existing annual power consumption can be generated from additional renewable resource, and that allows us to look at the delta between how much the installation is likely to cost and the likely electrical loading that can be reduced effectively from the grid, from the power you purchase. So that really then starts to pave the way for looking at funding. And fundamentally, we then need to understand your existing tariff, look at exactly how long that tariff lasts for, look at the capital cost for the PV installation and the likely electrical generation capacity it has. And we build in some resilience around inflation, we build some resilience in there around likely performance of the PV, so that we're not presenting you with a sort of best case scenario. It's a balanced model, and that allows us then to look at whether the right solution for a particular trust is to go down the route of self-funding via SEA, for example, or if there is a need to fund it via an operating lease, we can build in any of the finance charges and models around that, ultimately then looking at the potential savings. Needless to say, an operating lease will cost slightly more than if you funded it via SEA, but actually a lot of our clients go down that route because they don't have the reserves to afford it, and actually within the first year or two of the installation, they've actually they've already started to see savings over and above the interest charges. So actually the earlier you start, the better. And I think to Rob's earlier discussion around the volatility of the energy market at the moment, actually doing nothing is almost not an option at this stage, and we're working with a number of clients where the investment models stack up really well. Certainly did do 12 months ago, even more so now with the increase in energy pricing. So the longer you leave it to do these projects, actually you're missing out on the savings in between now and when you start the project. So really good opportunity to get going on some of these. So those first stages 1 to 4 really cover the sort of funding model, the viability and funding side of things. Subject to all of those things stacking up, and in almost all cases it does, we then start to look at program planning and risk, and this is where you really need to get some specialist input, specifically around the planning side. Now, generally speaking, PV is classified as permitted development, so you do need to apply for prior approval, but generally speaking, if your site is not in a conservation area or the buildings are not listed, then you shouldn't have any issues with installing PV. The only issues we've seen above that is where you've got high buildings overlooking and they could be subject to glint and glare. Again, something we can model and help get approval for. So then you're into the sort of site specifics. We would recommend structural surveys undertaken to look at both wind and snow loading and the impact of the existing PV a new PV installation on an existing roof. We would also start to look at condition of the existing roofs, location of plant, etc. And it may be we have to reduce the size of the array slightly rather than relocating plant. And it might be that we look carefully at roof selection, and actually we might advise you get a roof done before the PV, because these things are going to be on there for 25 years or so, and we don't want to get you obviously don't want to get into issues where roof coverings need replacing halfway through the life of your PV installation. So all of those things, then we start to get, once we've agreed the funding principles, we start to get into the site specifics. And because we take this iterative approach, if a scheme for whatever reason becomes non-viable during those technical technical stages, then a lot of what's been done already is purely desktop, so fairly low cost. Then we get into design, specification, and most importantly procurement. There are a number of suppliers and contractors out there who offer a turnkey funding and procurement solution. We have worked on some of those schemes, but generally speaking, our advice to clients is to run an independent procurement exercise. So on the projects we work on, almost all of those, we do an element of the design and specification, and oversee a procurement exercise where we're getting multiple quotations. Some of that's through frameworks, some of that is through tendering, which we manage. So, and fundamentally, the funding and the installation for most of the schemes, our recommended approach is to have those two very clearly defined and separate. So your funding is not influenced by the specification, and your procurement activity is not blinkered by the funding solution, and that way you get the best value, in our experience, the best value. And in most of our schemes, we when we do tender, we actually see some reduction in the capital cost through that, which strengthens the business case, and you get more saving for your investment. So once we've gone past that stage, we're then into technical due diligence and legals, a lot of the stuff we would do ordinarily on any project. And then actually stages 1 to 9 are pretty standard sort of oversight from a technical perspective in terms of managing the project. I'll come on to some of the pitfalls and issues on working on the live occupied sites, but I'll come to that shortly. The last point I wanted to make on this particular slide was around witnessing and commissioning and monitoring. A number of clients come to us where they've had PV installations installed in the past, some in the not too distant past, and actually they're not even sure whether they're working or not. And largely that is down to lack of paperwork, but also witnessing and commissioning being overlooked. So generally speaking, our engineers would do that on behalf of a trust rather than relying on a contractor, and we would get independent third-party checks done on the witnessing and commissioning to make sure that the PV array was functioning at the point of handover in the manner that it was designed. And it's amazing the number of times that that's not done properly, and therefore the investment has been made, but the savings aren't being realised because of a connection issue or similar. And then finally, and probably the most important part of all of this, is monitoring. So you've invested money on PV, you've made sure it was procured properly, designed properly, installed and commissioned properly, but you then want to test to make sure it's all performing as intended. And if not, there might be some action to take around maintenance or troubleshooting. So we focus quite heavily on monitoring, and we do that through internet-enabled devices to allow us to advise clients on making sure that in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years time that that PV array is working. So there's some of the things that we do. As I say, we're not a liege to any particular contractor, installer, financer. We like to sit as an advisor to the client and make sure that everything is done to the best possible standard. So onto LED lighting, and as you'll see, the process there has got a very similar order to the previous slide relating to PV, and that's because the process is pretty similar in terms of the cost calculations, funding, modelling, and actually the sort of design, specification, delivery. So whilst they are very different technologies, the installation management and the upfront business case to testing the viability is very similar. The fundamental difference for the LED lighting projects and as you would expect is down to the initial lighting survey. So as opposed to the desktop analysis we do initially on the PV side, the LED lighting is definitely a boots on the ground survey, and our engineers would generally look to access every room within a school and undertake a count and also a detailed schedule of the types of fitting in each room, so we can understand the existing energy profile or lighting energy profile. Typically lighting takes up around 70% of your electrical, 60 to 70% of your energy consumption within a school. But however, it is important that we understand the type of light fittings that you have installed. We have encountered business cases that were produced assuming that all lights were fairly low efficiency fluorescent, very old fluorescent light fittings, and therefore the delta between the energy efficiency of that existing or perceived existing light fitting and a new LED light fitting is quite large. However, in reality, what we see is a real mixed fleet of light fittings within an existing building, which ultimately means that some of those actually, although they may not be LED, may be fairly high efficiency compact fluorescents, for example, that may have been installed in the last sort of 5 to 6 years. So to understand the benefit, you really need to understand how the age and electrical characteristics or consumption characteristics of all of your lights to build a very detailed model of what that might look like. The other thing to consider during that survey as well is the existing infrastructure. Now, generally speaking, being an energy efficiency project, it won't tend to get involved in, the brief doesn't tend to include things like the condition of the existing wiring, or indeed any shortfalls in emergency lighting. However, we do have an initial look at those. The condition, we would need to see a 5-year electrical test certificate and any recommendation report, and with the emergency lighting, obviously we can undertake a survey, and as part of the lighting survey we can identify which of your lights are emergency fittings. So again, it may be that we enhance the budget and combine some of those additional condition issues in with the project, but generally speaking, we're looking at energy efficiency, so it would be, where possible, a point-for-point light fitting replacement. And the same situation also it should be considered when it comes to asbestos. So clearly, in existing buildings built pre-2000, we need to be very mindful of the presence of potential asbestos-containing materials, and therefore we would need to have a look at your existing management surveys, any refurbishment level surveys, and your asbestos management plan to understand the impact of that. Generally speaking, whilst we're happy to generally some clients would like to that we work with would like to resolve those issues at the same time, so that we don't muddy the waters when it comes to the funding model. We would tend to look at those as separate items, even if they are rolled into the same program. So once we've got all of that information, obviously we can advise on the likely carbon and cost calculations, and then start to look at funding. Again, different funding options. If we look at an operating lease, we would tend to look at a warranted life of around 10 years. PV, we would look over 25, and then we would model that accordingly. And once we got to that stage, actually, we're in a very similar process to the PV, and very often we run them in tandem, albeit with different supply chains. Is looking at design, specification, procurement, and then getting that on site. Likewise, with PV, we also look at monitoring electrical reduction, just to test and make sure that the savings that we'd identified are being seen. And if not, then we can identify issues, and some of those are largely down to sometimes the way buildings uses change, so extended hours, or some behavioural issues around people not turning lights off and the like. So again, we can use that monitoring to make sure we get the best out of the investment. So together we've undertaken some initial modelling. You've decided on your funding route. We've procured. We've selected an installing contractor. We now need to think about implementation of these projects. And there's often a dilemma here, because the sooner you start the work, the sooner you realise the saving. And with the additional pressure of energy price increases more recently, that's becoming more of a concern to many of the clients we work with. So sometimes it's difficult to wait for a summer holiday period, or any holiday period to get this done, because the whole business case is fundamentally forged on realising savings as quickly as possible. And what I would say is we've, the early part of this year, we delivered a significant quantity of PV and LED funded via Salix's public sector decarbonisation, and that work had to be done by the end of March. So with almost a standing start from January, we had no choice but to manage these projects on site during live occupied school hours, or indeed out of hours. And it absolutely does work, and there are some benefits to that as well. Whilst we carefully need to consider site management, carefully consider position of access and scaffolding, and clearly, most importantly, DBS and safeguarding, it is absolutely possible to get work done. Typical primary school for a relamping for LED, we can do possibly within a week, if not slightly longer than that, but certainly no longer than 2 weeks for a typical primary. And a lot of the supply chain we work with actually prefer to do out of hours working. And the cost premium isn't as much as you would anticipate, and often offsets the saving that you would achieve by getting those lights in earlier. So clearly, with some careful project management, site management, and thinking carefully about logistics planning, it is absolutely possible to complete work during term time. PV is, if anything, slightly more straightforward because all of the work is largely outside. There will be cable runs and inverters to install within plant rooms and inside the buildings, which will involve some work. But it's not particularly intrusive or invasive, nor is it particularly noisy. So, sometimes this requires some strong leadership from clients to insist on this. But what we have seen is it eminently deliverable during term time if needs be. Obviously, if your program falls fairly close to a specific summer holiday or any holiday period, then obviously that would make complete sense. But if that's not possible, there's definite ways around it. We thought it would be helpful to just share a little checklist, some of the things that we've seen often cause problems on projects. And so we've highlighted these kind of 6 headlines for consideration. The first being for value for money, and this is actually largely linked with procurement. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of solutions out there for installing PV and LED. Some of them will cost more because of the finance arrangements that are in place. And actually, it's about trying to achieve best value overall. And the concept around procurement and finance actually being completely separated, we are of the opinion that generates far better value for money because you aren't, first of all, you get some competition between tenderers, and secondly, the finance solution is not linked to a specific supply chain, and therefore you have more choice around who does the work and who finances the project. And to keep that line of separation, we believe is a good thing. From a procurement point of view, again, it may be that time is of the essence. We've successfully delivered projects via frameworks. For example, YPO have a framework for sustainable technology installation, and a number of major procurement bodies, ESPO, KCC, Kent County Council, Laser, etc. They're all setting up or have set up existing frameworks, new frameworks for installation, and they can be a really quick way to work with a trusted provider without having to go through some comprehensive pre-qualification process. However, there is still the traditional route, and we do operate very similarly on this side, where we're running traditional tender processes. Again, procurement is key. The savings that you will achieve long term, and bear in mind you're talking over 10 or 25 years, depending on whether you're going through LED and PV. The installation cost fundamentally drives is a significant part of that overall business case. So the more you can get for your money, clearly the better. The next one really is around quality, and I touched on some of this earlier, specifically relating to commissioning, but also the introduction of warranties on the installation. We don't recommend anything less than a 10-year warranty on LED light fittings, and we don't recommend anything less than around 25 years for PV. Fundamentally, so that you have a hassle-free installation, which is backed up by an independent, separate insurance-backed guarantee or warranty on the installation should anything go wrong, because the decision is all based on savings. So if these don't operate as intended, then that obviously leaves you exposed to additional cost. And so quality is got to be paramount. Overseeing the installation, make sure it is properly installed, make sure it is properly commissioned, and then that final point around checking periodically that it's performing as intended will hopefully close the gap on the overall risk there. Due diligence, I spoke about this briefly earlier. Up front, we do recommend a good amount of technical due diligence, legal due diligence as well. It may be that you need a license to alter, certainly for PV installations and the like, depending on the tenure and legal stance of your occupation of the buildings. Statutory approvals, I mentioned planning before. Another big issue specifically related to PV is DNO, which is distribution network operators. These are the organisations that effectively control how power is used across the grid regionally. And if, for example, you were to close a school for a period, which has obviously happened recently, and you had PV on your roofs, that electricity generation has got to go somewhere, and therefore it would generally be exported to the grid. So prior to any installation being fully commissioned, it is necessary to get a DNO approval on your proposal. And sometimes that does flag up issues where exporting to the grid in whatever circumstances would cause a strain on the local electricity infrastructure, and therefore the DNO might be resistant to you doing that. So again, a process that is time consuming, needs to be started early, but definitely one where there are some fairly significant pitfalls if it's not dealt with early on. And existing infrastructure I mentioned around condition of wiring, emergency lighting or lack of, and also asbestos. All those things need to be considered as part of that overall due diligence up front, making sure that when these projects start on site, there are very few issues. And finally, around risk, actually a lot of what we've been talking about is risk management. Fundamentally, that's what we are doing for our clients, largely around procurement, design, installation, and actually the delivery process on site. So clearly implications around safeguarding, insurance for work, and asbestos would be the big ones we would need to make sure are covered off together. And then finally, supplier credentials. It's a very buoyant market. There are a number of fairly new organisations working in this space from an installation point of view, and therefore, really checking out who's going to be undertaking your work. The past examples, not just examples of where they've done the work, but examples of where they can prove their installations have been successful in delivering the savings that have been intimated. A buoyant market, but we're finding a lot of fairly small organisations, and they are actually reliant on subcontractors to deliver a lot of their work. So again, worth doing some good due diligence on your suppliers. We thought it would be helpful to provide some case studies, really to provide some more specific data on likely cost and return, in terms of carbon saving and cost for projects that we've completed. So we've picked 3, and I just want to talk through these briefly. So Greenshaw Learning Trust, we've been working with Greenshaw for a number of years now, and actually we're just about to complete the final stages of their PV and LED programme, and we're about to start looking at electric vehicle charging and looking at more complex heat decarbonisation projects with them over the next few years. So just looking backwards then, Greenshaw elected to go down an operating lease route. They actually used 2 different funders for the different projects. That enabled them to start work earlier and start to realise savings, which they were already doing as a trust. And overall, their aspiration was to reduce their electrical consumption by 50% by this year, and actually within 2 years they've managed to achieve that. So phenomenal outcome, and fundamentally that's been done by installing PV and LED across their sites. So we haven't done all of their sites as yet. This is just for an initial tranche of 16. The overall investment was just short of £3 million. They funded that through an operating lease. Those costs there are the project delivery costs, including fees and the like, but don't include the finance costs. But then they're not significant on top of those. So just for comparison, it's a £3 million programme across 16 sites, and actually that's looking to that will likely achieve around 14,000 tonnes of CO2 over the warranted life, which is 10 years for the lights and 25 for the PV. And in terms of the sort of facts and figures, you can see there from that initial £3 million investment, I think it's around 3.1 in total, including the finance charges, they're actually securing £9 million saving over the next 25 years. So that's 3 times the initial investment. And what that's then allowing them to do is create a green recycling fund. So any surplus, and they have achieved a surplus already because of the savings that have been generated, any surplus is reinvested back into their green agenda by making further improvements to their carbon footprint, etc. So really good example of how using an operating lease can both release surplus but also enable some significant carbon savings. So yeah, they're on track already to reduce their electrical consumption in those schools by 50%, which is pretty staggering. That £9 million, coincidentally, is based on a current model of inflation, which actually sits below the level of inflation that they're currently foreseeing. So actually, we think that £9 million, if the trend continues, will actually be greater than that. But as I said earlier, a lot of our modelling is based not based on best case scenario, but looks at building in some contingency so that savings are more likely. So moving on, Greenwood Academies Trust, they've got a large number of schools. We're currently just focused on 9 of theirs at the moment. They've elected to use their extra SCA money that they've received over the last 2 years to invest in energy saving technology, which we certainly felt was a sensible use of that additional money. Generally speaking, the rest of their estate is in fairly good order, so they were lucky enough to be able to have this money available to spend on some of this. We fully recognise, and a lot of trusts will have more urgent projects and have had to spend their money differently. However, SCA can absolutely be used for these types of projects. We've completed 2 projects on secondary school for PV at 275,000, and we've completed 9 projects for LED. So the total investment they've made to date, this is actually the first phase. They've commissioned us for 2 further phases as well, including some boilers, but the total investment is 825,000. And actually, if you flip to the second from last bullet point there, that 825,000 investment is actually paid for over the 25-year period purely from 2 PV installations. So those PV installations at 2 secondary schools are likely to save over £1 million. So really good return on investment and a good example of that sort of concept of a green recycling fund. The other call out on this and pertinent to the current energy price situation is the trust is now buying 25% of their electricity at those 2 secondary schools for the equivalent of 3.4p per kilowatt hour, where currently trending rates are around the 30 mark. You're getting a significant, that investment of 275,000 is reducing carbon, but it's also giving you a fixed price effectively on 25% of your electricity for the next 25 years. So pretty stark and actually quite a good example, a very good example, I think, of where use of that SCA can be used to drive more operational savings. And finally, Academies Enterprise Trust. We wanted to include this because this was a scheme funded by PSDS, and it's just a good example of where you can deliver at scale and at pace. So the total this was part of an overall £3 million plus programme of work. Pulling out the PV alone was around 1.78 million over 12 sites, and that will save nearly £6 million over its warranted life based on the current energy price trend, but that is likely to be stronger, as suggested earlier. What's interesting about this one is actually we delivered all 12 of those in a 2-month period during live operating term time. So it absolutely can be done at scale and at pace. We had to hit those deadlines because it was a condition of the Salix funding, but it really showed what the supply chain can deliver in a relatively short period of time. And on this particular programme, largely the primary school PV we would do within a week to 2 weeks, and most of the secondary installations were completed within a 3-week period. So on this particular program, we had a series of we had one supplier, but that supplier had a series of gangs that went around and did individual sites on a rolling program. So definitely can be delivered in pretty quick time.
Thanks, Tom. And so that's hopefully given you a good understanding now of why we're doing this, what funding options are available to you, and a few bits of guidance about the practicalities of delivering these sorts of projects in your organisations. Obviously at Barker, we are very much able to help you on this journey, and are working with many of the largest trusts in the country, as well as countless individual schools and academies across the country on implementing their energy efficiency strategy. And the reason we think we're in a good position to help you with this is what this slide is all about. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, we're impartial, so we don't favour particular products, manufacturers, suppliers, funding solutions, or particular procurement routes. Obviously, every client is slightly different, and it's important that you are just given that information in an impartial and balanced way to make an informed decision about what's right for you, as opposed to perhaps some of the approaches that you might have had directly from suppliers or contractors, where you're not necessarily comparing like for like. And we're highly experienced at this. We've been delivering large programs of PV and LED alongside other sustainable technologies for a number of years now, and with our track record and affiliations to Confederation of Schools Trust, the Trust Network, and Association of School and College Leaders, we're very much working with these organisations and the sector as a whole to try and drive this energy efficiency agenda into the sector, because as we saw at the early part of the presentation, the financial case, as well as the moral and sustainability imperatives for doing this are so strong. The other thing that we do and take very seriously, sort of going back to what Tom was saying about the commissioning and monitoring, is looking at the data and making sure that we use hard data to both help you with the informed decision-making process at the beginning of the project, but also using that data to monitor, analyse and track the outcomes of the projects that you've done, so that you can both use it as proof of concept in your organisations, but also make sure that you are making the right decision for your organisation. And finally, as you probably know, with Barker, we are education specialists, so we understand some of the challenges in working in your schools. We understand how you're governed, operated, financed, some of the procurement rules, the Academies financial handbook, and some of the limitations that you have to work within. And we also obviously know how to deliver projects in live education sites, so we can really use all of that experience to make sure that your experience is as smooth as possible in going down this journey. So I hope that was useful, and in terms of next steps, we suggest that the first thing you can do is get us to look at an outline feasibility, and this can be done on a desktop basis. We don't charge for it, just to give you a very broad brush, as Tom mentioned, a very broad brush indication of what the savings might look like, an illustration of what the implementation of these technologies might look like for your organisation, whether you're a single school or a larger cluster. So that would be the stage one. If you've kind of got buy-in and approval to proceed on that basis, and it looks like a compelling way forward, then we can start working out more detailed proposals, whether it's an LED lighting survey or whether it's a PV solar edge type model that we looked at earlier, to just put some meat on the bones in terms of making it more site specific and starting to give you some illustrations based on the different funding models that we've discussed earlier, so that you can then take that again back to your organisations, senior leadership teams, trustee boards, etc., for sign off before you then progress to the next stages. So if you'd like us to help you with that, then obviously please contact us in the usual way, and we'll put some details up on the final slide today with our contact details, or you can email us at education@barker-associates.co.uk. And if you have any other questions, then please just contact us directly and we'll be pleased to assist in the same way. And finally, just to wrap up this particular session, just to highlight our last webinar that we did a few days ago on streamlined energy and carbon reporting, SECR. So if you've got an interest in this area, just to know that we've got a free SECR reporting tool that we're making available free to schools and trusts to help them with that carbon reporting, and rather than having to pay some large costs to other organisations to help you with that. And we're going to be doing some future webinars, the next one due to be about digitising the estate, slightly diverted from what we're talking about today, but covering some of the emerging technologies such as Internet of Things, sensors, cloud computing and the like, building information modelling, and how those could be implemented in your sites in the future. So it's a bit more of a sort of futuristic technology look forward, but quite interesting all the same. We're also going to be doing follow-up sessions on a couple of other technologies within the sustainability agenda, particularly talking about heat pumps and decarbonisation of heat, and also about your general energy strategy, having energy audits, and how you actually put a framework around all of this to help guide your energy strategy over the next number of years. And also we've been asked quite a lot about EV charging points for schools, and we've got a session on that. So please keep a lookout on all of our usual channels for those to be publicised, and we'll make those available as soon as in the coming weeks and months. So I hope you've enjoyed today and that was useful. I'm just going to finish on a final slide with some contact details, and as I say, please reach out to us if you would like any more information, or you would like us to prepare some outline feasibility information illustrations for you to see how you can get started on this journey. Very many thanks.